People go, well, that's not what I would want. How can that be? Well, look, this is what the law said. You let the government do your plan for you. Here's what it is. Hi, Jeff Mersace, the Plain English Attorney, and welcome to the video. Today, we are going to talk about freedom estate plans. All right, so this is a way to keep your estate free from as much government interference as possible. And I am also including here the attorneys who work within this government system and this probate court system. So we're really going to be talking about how a good, solid, revocable living trust and fully funding it exactly the right way and making sure your assets are titled properly and your beneficiary designation set up in a coordinated manner can keep the government away from your estate as much as possible. Now, a lot of people don't know an awful lot about revocable living trusts. I'm going to clip in something here that we recorded at really one of the most historic places of the American Revolution, Colonial Williamsburg.
So we're going to start with just a real quick story going back to colonial times and even further to medieval times and then further back to Roman times. It's how did people keep the government out of their estate? Well, the first thing in the Roman times, they had this thing called a revocable living trust. And it was a way to take control of your property and state, here's how I want things to happen, and here's who I want to receive things, and here's how I want it to go. But it's going to be held in a trust so that when I pass on, then it goes to the people that I want without the government staying involved. And then we have this last will and testament that kind of came around, and now suddenly it's, here's how I want the court to oversee my estate. And then you see the rise of probate courts. But let's go back a little bit to medieval times and even, I guess, Renaissance times, feudal times, when you had minor nobles and just landowners. There were unscrupulous people at the top of the government, really the major nobility, who, if they wanted someone's land, they would simply accuse them of a crime, get them convicted falsely, and then as part of the punishment, they'd be put to death, and then their estate confiscated. And of course, it went to those noblemen. So the government was basically allowing the confiscation of these estates. And so these landowners and minor nobles, they put together a revocable living trust. And so even if those nobles decided they wanted your land and accused you of a crime and convicted you of it, they couldn't take your land because it wasn't yours. It belonged to your trust. So that's just a little bit of the history of the revocable living trust leading up to colonial times. And now we're going to move to a different location, and we're going to get a little bit closer to the Capitol building over there, and we're going to talk about the very first revocable living trust, the very first freedom estate plan in the New World. State attorney.
So indeed.
I did have a question.
Sir.
Going back to one of your cases as a country lawyer, you actually drafted the first revocable living trust for the lieutenant governor. Why did you use that method rather than the more common last will and testament?
The lieutenant governor is my friend. He was also close to bankruptcy. Have you seen Roseville?
I have not.
Place is enormous. It's bigger than the Capitol building, 4 stories high. He just bit off more than he could chew. So I'm trying to do him a favor.
And there you have it. Patrick Henry used a revocable living trust rather than a last will and testament for someone because he liked them and knew it was a better thing to do. Gotta love attorneys.
So with that history of the revocable living trust and how it came to be, and how one of our founding forefathers, Patrick Henry, was actually involved in that, it's easy to see that they understood freedom and keeping government away from things as much as possible.
If you think it's important for educational videos like this to get out there, then please help us out by subscribing to the channel.
But I'm going to go ahead and give a little review of general laws. Three types of laws that are out there in the US system, but I'm not taking it from the perspective of attorneys and legislators and whatnot, because well, there's constitutional law, there's statutory law, there's no, 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 no. Let's talk about how it impacts you. First, we have kind of what I call essential or necessary laws where the government is protecting its citizens. So these essential laws are really protecting against foreign invaders. So they have to set up a military and they have the government behind that. All right, we're going to talk about a roads, roads and infrastructure and police and things like that. These are these essential laws to protect citizens. And this also includes things like regulations of companies that produce food. And so, like the FDA, there can be a ton of debate about how far government should go in one direction or another on any particular topic. And these are too much regulations, not enough regulations over here. Look, that's all debatable. That's political. But as far as the laws, it's about protecting the citizens. Whether you agree with how they're doing it or not is a totally separate question. Second area of laws and regulations that the government gets into are really about making sure citizens versus citizens, citizens versus corporations, corporations versus corporations, that we don't end up with disputes that result in these kind of old style duels and people just going ahead and hitting other people. It's the court system to make sure that we end up with a civil society, one where we take disputes and have it worked out rather than just whoever has the biggest punch or the biggest gun ends up being the victor. That's not how we want things to work in a civilized society. We want progress. We want to be able to have a solid economy and not one based on, well, how much can I take from everybody else? Because then nothing actually gets built. But where we get to estate planning is the third one. And this is where I kind of call it the responsibility laws. It's where the government puts in place rules and regulations if you're not living up to making your own decisions. Now, I'm going to tell just a little bit of a story uh, going back to when I was taking most of my continuing legal education courses with the State Bar Association, and they gave these CLEs, and you have to have so many hours as an attorney. And I went to this long one on kind of a day long thing on trust and estate planning. And I sat there for about 2.5 hours, maybe even more. And it was like the 178 changes to the law that happened in this past year regarding trusts. I'm like, wow, okay, there must be a lot of action going on here. You know what? 176. I went back and I counted 176 of these 178 laws were all, well, if the trust doesn't say, then here's what the law puts in place. And so my question 176 times was, well, why isn't that addressed in the trust? And I went back and looked. There was these couple of things that I didn't get, the 178 versus 176. They were dealing with like tax breaks for people who own fish hatcheries or something just very, very specific that none of my clients actually had anything to do with. So it's like, well, why didn't you put it in the documents? Well, this is kind of the same thing with citizens who are adults. If you're not going to put together your own estate plan, well, then you're opting for the government to decide for you. Do you really want the government deciding who's important in your life, who you want making decisions, who's going to end up receiving your estate, or do you want it done yourself? You're going to work your whole life, you're going to build up whatever wealth you can build up. Whatever you don't spend, you want it to go a certain way. You're going to leave that up to the government? And even worse, there's a government process that's going to whack off anywhere from 4 to 10% going through a probate court system if you don't set things up to avoid it. So, for my clients that want to avoid this government and court and attorney interference, th- having a good freedom estate plan that's going to have a revocable living trust at the core of it, this is what's going to end up giving you what you want with as little government interference as possible. So, what exactly happens when we have these laws that are put in place and you haven't made your decision? What's kind of the end result? Well, first of all, the people you want making financial decisions for you in the event of, say, a health crisis, something bad happens and you're in a coma for 6 months and you haven't put together any documents that say who's getting it. Well, okay, well, the state government says you've got your next of kin, and all of your next of kin by relation, whichever is closest, they get to make these decisions for you. But you have to go to court and you have to get guardianship. And so they have to prove that you are not capable of making these decisions for yourself long term. And there's nobody else there that's stepping in legally. And if you don't have a power of attorney, then there's no one there stepping in legally. So the state is deciding. Let's just say it's a widower, 3 kids. Two of them are just not responsible with money at all. The third one, maybe they're sort of responsible, but what they would really want is their brother. Nope, we're going to make all 3 kids guardians unless we can have some sort of court battle. Now, suddenly you're getting into thousands of dollars and getting an attorney and people fighting over who gets control of your money. When if you just had the plan set up the right way, then you wouldn't have had to have this. What about health care decisions? Well, it's also kind of the same thing where someone has to become a guardian over your person and have to make these decisions if you don't put these things in place yourself. So, again, that scenario with the 3 kids, all three are equally in line to make these decisions. And until there is some kind of adjudication or acknowledgement, the doctors are going to make their best decision. And it doesn't matter what you would have wanted, you don't have a healthcare agent at that point. So, all right. So now it could end up being a free for all going in and out of the court system because under these responsibility laws, if you haven't put in place the people you want, the government has that plan for you. All right. What about the allocation and distribution of your estate? Well, here's North Carolina, and there's a lot of similarities in other states. They have different percentages and whatnot. In North Carolina and a lot of other states, the surviving spouse doesn't get everything. If it ends up in probate, the surviving spouse is not 100% beneficiary in North Carolina. People go, well, that's not what I would want. How can that be? Well, look, this is what the law said. You let the government do your plan for you. Here's what it is. In North Carolina, the surviving spouse gets the first $60,000 of personal property. And then if there's one child, then it's a 50-50 split. If it's two or more children, they split 2/3 and the spouse only gets 1/3. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. How can that happen? Well, it's because you didn't do what you needed to do and put it into your own freedom estate plan. So this is how it goes. We were talking recently with a person. It was a widow. Big unfortunate thing. her husband died in a car accident. It was a drunk driver, and now there's this potential big lawsuit and a lot of potential money coming in. But the kids are like, and I'm making this up, like 8 and 10 or something like that. All right, well, she gets the first 60,000, and all of the other finances, life insurance, and the potential money from this lawsuit, it's going to get split 3 ways. And because the kids are underage, there's going to have to be a trust set up through the court system until the kids turn 18. And then when the kids turn 18, they get their inheritance, which could be like, in this particular case, like $1 million or more. That's just going to get thrown into the lap at 18. That's ridiculous. People aren't responsible at 18. Look, I'm with you. I'm right there with you. And a lot of my clients, kind of the really bare minimum age of just, here you go, here's a significant inheritance. 25 is all the way at the low end. Most of my clients pick 40, and they have a good solid trustee who's going to make the decisions and potentially give it to them far earlier if they're responsible. But okay, they can hold it up until 40 just to make sure there's that responsibility there. That's what my clients would want, but that's not what the law says. So if you're letting the government choose for you, there you go. The government ends up making this decision for you. All of these gaps are filled in if you're not being responsible enough to put in place your own plan.
Give fire.
But now let's talk about probate, because here's where a lot of the lawyers get involved. In fact, I'd even say you can really call it a lawyer's tax, where they're getting paid to handle things through this court system if you use a last will and testament. If anyone ever told you, I have a last will and testament, my estate doesn't have to go through probate, they are 100% wrong. A last will and testament is your wishes regarding the allocation and distribution of your estate, who's the executor, and potentially even who I want as a guardian if anything happens to me and I got minor kids. All that stuff is through the probate court. So you're really putting the court, the government, in charge of overseeing all of your estate. So let's talk about the 4 big downsides of probate. I don't want to go too long on this because we've got other videos, but I'm going to keep it as brief as I can. First big downside, there's about a 4 to 10% cost. Look, and this is expenses, but in a lot of cases, it's the attorney's fees. The attorneys end up getting a big chunk of this, getting paid to handle the paperwork. If the person who ends up as the personal representative doesn't want to do it, the attorney's fees end up being really, really big. Like I said, between 4 and 10%. Now, California, they actually have a statutory fee, 5%. Okay, so let me tell you, we had one case. We discovered this account and needed to get an ancillary probate proceeding set up because the amount was too high. And so we had to hire an attorney. They got the statutory percentage for one bank account, just one bank account. We get the check. That account was something like $700,000. And the attorney is getting like, it's 5% of a statutory fee. So 5% got taken off. Second big downside is where we have the delays and everything that has to happen. It's 6 months to a year and a half. And look, an estate going 2 or more years is really not unheard of. There's also written into this government probate process, here are certain time frames and minimum time periods. You have to file this, and then there's at least this time before we can go to the next step. And then there's a lot of gathering of information and all this other stuff, and it becomes extremely frustrating that it takes so long. Whereas with a revocable living trust in a freedom estate plan, it can get distributed pretty quickly. So, third big downside, it is more open to being contested. And it's, again, because the government actually makes it easy within these probate court rules to contest an estate. So if you're using that last will and testament and not a freedom estate plan, you're not using a revocable living trust. Okay, all it really takes is for someone to say that they're not happy, is to file some paperwork. They'll get an attorney to do it. And suddenly everything kind of comes to a grinding halt until their issue is settled. And so if the attorney's like, well, okay, yeah, I think maybe we got like a less than a 5% chance that something's going to happen here, but look, let's give it a try. One thing courts typically make sure is all of the attorneys get paid, because the probate court wants to make sure we're getting everything right. And if it means there's this expense of paying the attorneys to make sure everything's going to the correct beneficiaries, even if the amount is greatly reduced, we want to make sure we've got these percentages correct. Okay, the lawyers get paid. So, fourth big downside, privacy. Look, these are court proceedings. And so everything that's kind of filed with the probate court gets opened up to the public. Now, there are protections. They're not going to give out social security numbers and things like that. But the names, ages, and addresses of the beneficiaries are there. The inventories that end up getting filed have to have the date of death balances on all these accounts. And they're public filings, so they're open to the public. Now, there are a lot of con artists, and there are uh, also a lot of scam people or just marketing people, and they get the names and addresses of these beneficiaries and they can start marketing them or targeting them. All that information is out there when it goes through this government probate court process. This is why a lot of my clients really want to avoid having anything to do with the government handling their estate, but unless they have the right type of plan, it's just not going to happen. So now we're talking about what exactly is going to happen if you do have a freedom estate plan. What's in there? Well, there's the revocable living trust is the core of it. And so now you can decide who's in charge of it, who your beneficiaries are, what the percentages are. Everything that works with the trust is not going through this court system. There's also the power of attorney, the healthcare power of attorney, various other documents. Now, we're going to go ahead. It should be active by the time this video is released at freedomestateplans.com. Again, freedomestateplans.com. We've got a free course that you can set up with, and it's going to include my book, The Freedom Estate Plan, and walk through all of these things with you. So there's a lot of good information in here. So there is a significant problem if you don't put together your own plan the way you want it done. In a lot of cases, my clients want to avoid probate. They want a freedom estate plan. They want to be able to pass on their legacy to their loved ones without also having this huge burden. So, as I believe Patrick Henry would have said, give me liberty, even in death. Check out the free course at freedomestateplans.com. And as I always tell my clients, please stay safe, plan ahead, and enjoy life. And whatever you do, make it a great day.
I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.